Years ago, a bunch of British astrologers got together to celebrate this, the five who are known as the Club of 27. This resonates deep within the collective psyche. In other words, if you ask ordinary folk, I noticed the amazing fact, they might name these five people, right? Nobody told them, nobody spelled it out, but it was part of the collective psyche. And we actually did this in 2005 before we did it before the Wikipedia site of Club of 27 went up, our study, and it was based on, if I may just explain, the fact that at the age of 27, the planet Uranus has gone around 1/3 of its orbit. You get what's called a trine, and Neptune, exactly takes exactly half the period, have gone around 1/6 of its orbit. So those two exact aspects measured out, we found very precisely when these guys passed away. Very closely attuned to those Uranus and Neptune particular angles. So we had a group of us going over these, and the question we're looking at today is a general feeling. Again, it's a popular consciousness that Amy Winehouse, the songbird of Camden, is somehow part of that group. Okay?
That's very interesting, Nick. So this age that people died at, Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, I believe, and Amy Winehouse.
And Kurt Cobain. That is measured out very much by the planet Uranus, 27 years, and 1/6 the motion of Neptune. And Uranus is the planet of youthful rebellion, okay? And very often it's the most creative time in your life, that 27-year period. And it's before what astrologers call the Saturn return, which is when you really become grown up and adults at the age of 29. So these are people who didn't, as it were, become, you know, mature, grown up. We remember them forever for their tremendous youthful fire and the Dionysian wild spirit of abandon. Yeah.
We're going to talk to several people today. Can you introduce who we're going to talk to, Nick?
Yeah, okay. Let's start off with Alex, who will introduce Janis, comment on Janis Joplin.
We're going to talk to Alex Trenoith about the Club of 27. So what's your involvement with this, Alex?
Well, when we did Club of 27, I was a big fan of Janis Joplin, so I really wanted to take Janis Joplin on. And it was my first public appearance as an astrologer, the first time I did a proper talk at the Astrological Lodge of London. And so I was full of nerves. And of course, Nick was there, and the lodge was packed full that day, that evening, and I was, as I say, terrifically nervous. And one thing that kept going through my mind was that when Janis appeared at Monterey, she said, "Do it like you're never going to get another chance." And that's very much the way I felt that night, was I was going to channel Janis, and I was going to deliver my part of the Club of 27 like I was never going to get another opportunity to do that. So I felt I had channeled Janis that evening. But some of the things I like about Janis's chart is that she is an Aquarius rising. And Aquarians like to say that they are the rebels of the zodiac, and they like to do things their own way, and they're unconventional. But Janis is very aware of the fact that she was a Capricorn, because she went around with a group of friends who called themselves the Capricorn ladies. And Capricorn is kind of the boring sign of the zodiac. It's the hard workers, it's the people that like to make sure that things get done. But she's got this wonderful Aquarius rising energy, and as Nick talked about Uranus, that's the ruling planet of her chart. But it's also co-ruled by Saturn, and these two planets are in conjunction in her chart. They're right next to each other. So she could swing between the really zany and wild, but she also had this deep conventional side, this hard-working ethic side of her, which actually comes out in a lot of her music. She was a perfectionist in the recording studio. She wanted things done just right.
Which is a very down-to-earth person as well.
Well, apparently she was somebody who she's very inclusive. As a teenager, she was known as somebody who she absolutely shunned racial prejudice. She was all for feminine equality, and she grew up in a time in the 60s when these things were very advanced, because in America at that time, segregation was still going on in certain parts of the country, and she really wanted to put an end to all that, and she listened to music that black people were known for, and she sang the blues, which is a particular black form of music at that time.
So are you going to show us some of these charts that you've done?
Absolutely. Well, we have Janice's chart here. So this is what an astrological chart looks like. And what an astrological chart is basically a snapshot of the heavens. And it's where the planets are when a person's born. And this chart is interesting to an astrologer because the shaping itself it shows a kite. You can see it very clearly. And we like to say that people with a kite formation in their charts are high flyers. And we know from Janice's successes that she really was somebody who was highly successful in her particular field. It's hard to imagine Janice as an artist, which was where her other interests were. She went to art school and she, had an interest in that, but it was for her music that we remember her.
Well, I think that's very interesting because a lot of famous musicians went to art college or art school and kind of started there and then progressed into music. So it's really about creativity. So can you tell us a bit more about this chart where the creativity is and the elements?
Well, she has a loaded 12th house, and these people with lots of 12th house stuff in their charts are people who are able to be very intuitive and to tune in to what is important in the world at that time. So she was of the 60s. I mean, she was a teenager and grew up in front of us in the 60s, where there was lots of turbulence going on. The Vietnam War was raging and lots of other things were going on. So she, sort of embodied that understanding of what was happening in the world at that time.
So as far as the rest of the chart goes, obviously there's other planets involved here.
Yeah.
Can you just go through that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go through a few points that are really, I think, very important. She had the moon in Jupiter in Cancer, and it's in the 5th house. And so when we saw her on stage, she was totally focused in on the emotion of the moment, and she was able to deliver and tune into her audiences. When she came on stage, she really became alive, but not in an obnoxious kind of way. I mean, not astrologically anyway. She was just extremely aware of the feelings of her audience and how beneficial it would be for a performer to understand your audience. I mean, it's not something that anybody else might have been able to really get to grips with, but Janice did. And she was able to deliver performances that were gut-wrenching, which is another thing I would associate with Moon conjunct Jupiter. She really pulled it out of her. When she sang, it was all about what she really felt. And I think particularly it's also interesting that Janice has her moon in the early degrees of Cancer, and Amy Winehouse has her moon in the opposite sign in the early degrees of Capricorn. So there's a connection between these two women, who are the only women of the Club of 27. And I think it's very powerful. And although, of course, they lived in different times, there's still a common ground between the two women.
So how do planets like Venus fit into this?
Well, Venus is what we like and what we appreciate and enjoy. And Janice has a lot of stuff in the 12th house. And we know that Janice was a drug user. And unfortunately, the 12th house it can relate to addictions and things like that. Now, Janice would not have appreciated being told what to do. She has Venus in Aquarius, and they like to do things their own way. They also have a detachment in relationships. They hold people at an arm's length, and that's pretty much the way Janice was. She had a lot of famous affairs. She had a very well-known affair with Jim Morrison. They ended up having a big row when Jim told her that she couldn't sing the blues, and she took a bottle of Jack Daniels and knocked him over the head with it. But yet they were lovers. And worse, they were lovers when they were both married or committed to other people, and it caused a lot of controversy. But that's the kind of thing that someone with Venus in Aquarius wouldn't take too much mind of, the conventional side of commitment. They would want to branch off and do things their own way. This is John Etherington, and John is a huge music fan, and he's been to more concerts than anybody, I think, on the planet. And also he has the distinction of actually living through the 60s. I mean, I was born in the 60s, so I was very, very young when Janice and Jimmy and all them died. But John has actually been through many, many concerts, and he's got a lot to say about the Rolling Stones in general.
I was into the Beatles and the Searchers and then the Stones. Now, that's when it got seriously exciting and seriously interesting. And I remember standing on the doorstep when I was about 12 with Come On blasting out of my transistor radio and watching the terrified looks on people's faces as they walked by. and I felt this amazing sense of power. And the first Stones record I bought was It's All Over Now, and I was an obsessive fan for about 2 years. I bought all the key singles at the time they came out, and I finally got to see the Stones in the Park in '69, which was a great moment for me. And I saw
was just after Brian had died, wasn't it?
It was just after he died, about a few days afterwards. It's a 7-year cycle with Brian. He went out under a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in '69. And it's also interesting that Nick Drake, the singer, who died when he was 26 and a half, actually met the Rolling Stones when he was on the road in Aix-en-Provence in France. He stopped at a cafe, and the Rolling Stones were actually there, and he actually played guitar to Brian Jones. And they're two similar spirits in some ways, of that, you know, sort of doomed, fated youth. We might say in psychology the puer aeternis figure, that you know, it's the youth who flies to the sun, but comes, wings melt, and he comes crashing down. And
Icarus.
yeah, Icarus, exactly. The rock and roll cycle is that of Jupiter and Uranus. Rock and roll itself started under a Jupiter-Uranus conjunction.
Can you just explain that, John?
Well, when the two planets Jupiter and Uranus come together, which is only about every 12, 13 years, 14 maybe, you know, it signifies a new exciting beginning, a new spirit of adventure, and it seems to be a cycle that is involved very much in the arts and also music. Rock and roll itself with Elvis started under that, and so did the opposition, the next big beat boom, which involved, you know, Dylan and the Beach Boys and the Beatles, and just a tiny bit later, but under the same influence, is the Rolling Stones.
As far as the different aspects of, say, Brian Jones's chart, can you actually tell us a bit about why you think he sort of self-destructed so quickly?
A difficult parental situation, actually. He had a sister who died of leukemia when he was 4. And he also had a naturally rebellious nature, which is personified by his Mars-Uranus conjunction, which is also conjunct Saturn, actually. But he led a rebellion at school when he was quite young. And he was rejected by his parents because of his rebellious nature. And eventually they threw him out of the house. He had 5 illegitimate children. He made 3 women pregnant before he was 20, which is absolutely outrageous at that, in the early 60s. So he, in a sense, he actually set the ball rolling for the whole permissive society and the whole 60s, you know, the whole 60s rock and roll scene. And the trouble was, he was quite a sensitive, emotional person. He had also had Moon conjunct Pluto, which is a very intense, jealous, possessive, emotional nature. Although paradoxically, he wanted complete freedom. He had Venus in Aquarius.
Like Janus.
Yes, in opposite to the Moon. And whenever he made a woman pregnant, he sort of seemed to reject her as a lover and moved on. So there was this problem. And so he was a man who wanted sexual freedom, but was incredibly jealous and possessive of the women he was with. And that, combined with a lot of drugs and the falling out with the other members of the Rolling Stones, did lead to a gradual breakdown. And I think psychically he just wasn't strong enough to contain it all, really.
Next on the show, we're going to talk to top British astrologer Andrew Morton about the late Jim Morrison.
If you looked at that chart before this life unfolded, you wouldn't necessarily, of itself, pick this out and tell the life story in advance. You wouldn't necessarily predict this because, you know, these are standard planets in standard signs in standard houses. So what makes this different? Well, apart from anything else, Jim Morrison was, and the 2 planets have already been mentioned, those key outer planets, Uranus and Neptune, which are very significant in people's charts. At that particular period in time, he was born where these 2 planets were in a very easy flowing aspect, which we call a trine. In other words, the energies flowed very readily
Which
between
planets are those, Andrew?
Uranus and Neptune. But they're not personal planets, they're generational. So in a sense, people like this will capture that sort of, I don't know what you call it, the zeitgeist of an era with those planets. But the particular thing about the Jim Morrison, and now this is black and white, so it may not show, is that he has Neptune. Now, we could call it his Neptune, but it's generational, so we don't, in what we call the 8th house. And to cut a long story short, what this particularly refers to is the house of taboo. the house where things pass between people that are not spoken. In other words, intimacy of any sort. It also has a lot to do with money and inheritance and things like that. So in a sense, by having this planet captured here, that's where his fantasy was. That's where his idealization was, in this house of taboo. So the whole thing was really the ultimate sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of experience. Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, possibly Mars. These are the planets that make up a persona, an individual personality. And it's that combination, if you strip out everything else, that tends to say, that's you. And this particular Neptune in his chart is actually, if you like, almost captured by an aspect to his Mercury. And an aspect is an angular relationship. It's the way we look at things. So his Mercury being his voice, the way his mind worked, the way he articulated things, the words that he used. And one of the key things about Jim Morrison was the way he constructed lyrics. They had this sort of effect of sort of transporting one somewhere else. What is not visible are angular relationships between planets that the eye can't actually see.
Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Angles, where planets are in a relationship that's angular, i.e. if they're together, we call it a conjunction. If they're at 90 degrees to each other, we call it a square. If they're opposing each other in the sky, we call it an opposition, and such like. We can see those in a chart with our eyes. That's what we generally use. But there are other angular relationships, division of the circle by a number. For example, there's 360 degrees in a circle, you divide it by 5, you get an angular relationship of 72 degrees. Now you see, if I go on about this, it's very, very technical, but your eye doesn't pick those out.
Yeah.
But they are all sorts of energetic motivations and inspirations, triggers that are going on below the surface. What happens with certainly Jim Morrison and a number of other people in this club of 27 is it's not necessarily what you can see that makes the difference. It's actually what you can't see. Now we have astrological techniques, one of which I specialize in, which is called harmonics, which is a way of pulling these angular relations out so that we can see them. This guy has so much of this stuff going on underneath the surface, far more than is visible, some of which is exceptionally creative, which tells you something about, you know, not just, oh, he had Mercury square Neptune, but there's an enormous creative reservoir being generated, coupled with, in another harmonic chart I pull out, shows he's got actually a very strong determination.
That's really interesting. So, Dr. Nick Collerstrom, would you just like to have a final word on this? It's been absolutely fascinating.
Can I say a few words about Jimmy?
Yes.
Jimmy's chart here, first of all, it's all trines and sextiles. Those are aspects of harmony, and there's no squares in it. Squares give the structure of life, and these are absent. So the spirit of wild abandon is shown in this chart. This chart really expresses a sense of funky rhythm, I would say. But notice the terrific opposition here between Sun and Uranus, Saturn. Very powerful opposition in this chart. And this is within a day or so of the chart for the atomic energy, the splitting of the atom. So I feel that terrific power of the destruction of the atom. This is in Jimmy's moment of birth, and you feel a terrific crackling, something called the cataclysmic chords of Jimmy's music that he manages to get. That terrific opposition, and it's actually right on two very powerful fixed stars, Antares and Aldebaran, which are exactly opposite each other, Sagittarius, Gemini, in the sky, and his big planets are lined up with those two fixed stars. He's actually got three major stars in his chart, also Regulus, and hardly any people have three major fixed stars in the chart. Notice also Jupiter, I'd like to point out, when Jimmy arrived in London in the autumn of '66, that was the terrifically powerful sudden moment when his career began. He called himself Jimi Hendrix, and he really became the #1 rock and roll guitarist. That was Jupiter returned. Jupiter was then, at his age of 24, was then on his Jupiter, and then as it moved over, I found very much the big stages of his life were to do with Jupiter's motion. I think the Monterey Festival was when Jupiter got to his Neptune. So Jupiter had a key moment for him. Also, Mark, I'd just like to say that, as we've heard earlier, Jimmy was a musician for exactly 7 years. When he came out of the army to his death, that was quite from 62. That was quite exactly a 7-year period in which his amazing creative life took place.
Okay, so we just wanted to say a couple words about Kurt Cobain. Unfortunately, Neil Spencer, who presented Kurt Cobain on the night, couldn't be here today. So we have Kurt's chart, and I think what's striking about his chart is that he has a kite formation as well in his astrological chart. But I also think it's fascinating that he was born during the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, which straddles his ascendant. And so he's kind of carried the flame of the Club of 27. He's sort of the bridge between the generations. Now, but we're here tonight because we wanted to commemorate the death of Amy Winehouse, who it's 4 years today that she died.
And by the pub, the Hawley Arms, where she used to sing as the Songbird of Camden.
So what's striking about her chart is that her planets are in a series of conjunctions in pairs. And of course what we know about Amy was that she wrote a lot about her relationships, and it was actually a relationship that brought about her downfall. A lot of people have asked questions, who should become a member of the Club of 27, because there are lots of musicians who actually died at that age. But not all of them qualified to be a member of the Club of 27 simply because they're not as famous. But we felt that Amy needed to be inaugurated today into the Club of 27 because she was so incredibly talented and well known.
It's interesting that Amy came on the scene under a Jupiter-Uranus opposition.
Yes.
I think that was about 2004. There was opposition which brings her into that whole Jupiter-Uranus cycle.
Yeah,
as
and
well.
if memory serves, she was born with Jupiter conjunct Uranus. Well, in 2007, she actually started making her name, won the Grammys, and really started becoming well known in 2007 on her Jupiter return, so around the age of 24, when Jupiter would have been transiting.
But it's also interesting you say that with the planets in pairs, and what she talked about was relationships. But actually one of these pairs is actually a Venus-Mars conjunction.
In Leo.
In Leo.
Yes.
So,
the hair.
Yes.
The big hair,
So would she be talking about relationships or not? With Venus, with a Venus-Mars conjunction, and in fact being in Leo as well. So
yeah, and she also has Saturn conjunct Pluto. I believe it's in the 4th house. And it's her performances, like Janice's, were known for being gut-wrenching. She was actually able to tap into those feelings and project them out onto the stage. Most people don't, chase death for fun, whereas that's kind of what the Saturn-Pluto implies. She really wanted intensive experiences. And I was saying to Nick the other day that, we were wondering why she took so many drugs, but I believe she was trying to replicate those experiences, intense experiences she had on stage, which no normal person could do off stage. And so in searching for that ultimate thrill, she was dicing with death.
So tell us, Alex, Amy's death, was it marked out by the Uranus trine, just like we saw with the
absolutely.
other?
Just like the other members of Club of 27. At the height of her career, when Uranus is trine its natal point, Amy died.
Oh, right.
She burned herself out. And bearing in mind that she had Jupiter-Uranus in conjunction when she was born. So it was a very intensified and drawn-out process.
Oh.